is studying his life, and I myself came to admire him. Number one, I admire that he stood for justice. It amazes me when I study the story of early Islam, how quickly the Muslim Ummah forgot the contributions of the family of Muhammad. Imam Hussain was the grandson of the main prophet of Islam. And yet the Islamic household was turning against him. And he didn't back down. He stood for justice. As I study the agreement that they had with Muawiyah, the Ummah would decide who should lead Islam, who would be the caliph. It was not right. And Imam Hussain was not afraid to say, it's not right. And he stood for justice. And he said, oh, your word is your word, a pact is a pact, an agreement is an agreement. And when you go back on your word, as you know, from the eastern part of the world, if I give you my word, if I sign an agreement, I need to be true to that agreement. And Imam Hussain was part of the household of Muhammad. They should have respected his opinion. But he stood for justice. And he wasn't afraid to raise his voice when something wasn't right. Now, in this world, sometimes where people are afraid of getting canceled and of being talked poorly about on social media, I think this is a valuable lesson for all of us to remember when we study the life of Imam Hussain. When we see something that is not right, though the heavens should fall, we should call sin by its name. And we should say that's not right. And we should stand for justice and for other people. Number two, why I admire him, is that he stood for religious freedom. He could have just said, well, you know, the caliphate has gone to the house of the Umayyads and Muawiyah, and now his son Yazid. This is our religion. This is what my grandfather tried to establish. I'm not going to say anything about it. But he didn't. And he showed what a dangerous combination it is when government and power gets mixed with religion. Because by virtue of being in a religion where we worship an almighty God, it is God himself who gives us the right to think. And it is God who is the one who is to form our conscience. And as the worship of the God, that's why I like Allah. It means the one God. There is one almighty God in the universe. And it is he who forms the conscience, and when humans try to stifle that, bad things happen. And we see in the life of Imam Hussain that he was not afraid to speak his conscience. He was not afraid to stand up for what he believed. And I'm sure he came to some of those conclusions religiously, learning from his father Ali and his grandfather Muhammad, that this was the right thing to do, and so he stood up for freedom. And I believe in a world where all too often, it's gotten better from the Middle Ages. If you look in the Middle Ages, there was very little religious freedom. You could not speak out against the local powers. We have some of that, but religious freedom does not happen all the time. And a conscience is a divine thing. That's why Martin Luther in the Protestant tradition said it's a dangerous thing. Once you've come to a conviction and you've prayed and you've studied, to go against that just because the power says you shouldn't. Imam Hussain stood for religious freedom. He stood for what he believed. Number three, Imam Hussain loved his people. As I read the story of how he was called to Kufa, I think I would have been tempted to say, you know what? It's kind of dangerous. Number one, that was a long trip across the Arabian desert. It was hot. You're out there in the middle. I've flown across the Arabian desert from Amman, Jordan, over to Kuwait. And I remember it was 2.5 hours of just sand. I mean, there was just one little road out there, and every 50, 100 miles, there's a gas station. I thought, my word, how does anybody cross this thing? And the fact you would go across that desert to Kufa to help your brothers and sisters shows the depth of the care for people. I found this quote, and again, I'm not into all the hadith, and probably Saeed Imrani can talk to me about where this came from. But this is what I found that Imam Hussain said. I did not go out for fun and selfishness and for corruption and oppression. Rather, my goal is to correct the corruptions that have occurred in the nation of my ancestors. I want to command the good and forbid the bad and follow the tradition of my grandfather and the way of my father, Ali ibn Abi Talib. He wasn't doing this for fun. He had a compassion for people. How desperately the world needs to hear that today. How desperately we need more of us to care about each other, to care about morals, to care about the afterlife, to care about the physical well-being of each other. And regardless of faith tradition and which world religion, or as you know, in Christianity, we have almost 40,000 Protestant denominations in America, in the world. There's a lot of division. But what if we all just said, just like Sayyid Imrani said, you know, we're all equals in humanity. We're all brothers and sisters. We all bleed the same blood. What if we had that compassion for each other? I think also of when Imam Hussain told his followers, and for those of you who are not Muslims, you can go home and Wikipedia the whole story. But he had a small group. If I were Imam Hussain, I probably would have said, now everybody needs to stand down because there's an army of about 4,000 people coming. And what did he do? He offered them all the opportunity to go home. He knew they were coming for him. He could see that his fate might not be the best one. And what did he do? He cared enough about the people around him and he said, it's okay. You can go home. But people loved him. I can tell that when you read this story because they stayed with him. And they realized he cared about them. And they stayed with him and met the same fate he did. A gruesome, terrible fate. Why? They wouldn't have stayed unless they realized he cared for them. What a tremendous lesson that we can learn from him. The fourth and last reason I admire Imam Hussain is that he, just like many of the Protestants that I admire, valued his conscience more than life itself. He was not afraid to meet death. So many times I've noticed, especially in other parts of the world where there isn't religious freedom, people do have convictions, but they're afraid to say them. Why? Because, well, you might meet the fate of death. When I study Imam Hussein's story, I see he wasn't afraid of death. It was better for him to die than to go against his conscience. He understood that there was something better that God has prepared for us. That is something we share with you in Islam, a belief in a resurrection, just like in Surah Yasin where it says, Inna nahnu nuhi al-maut. We shall raise the dead. That the God we serve is more powerful than death, and when we remain true to our conscience, He can raise us from the dead. We do not have to fear death. Can you imagine what this world would be like if we were all convicted so much that we would stand true to our conscience, we would love people, we would fight for justice, and if we died, it's okay. We would have an army of people doing righteous acts. That inspires me. That is the hope of the believer. That is the hope, and by the way, I still pray almost every day the Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah ar-Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Malika yawm ad-din. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. Istina as-sirat al-mustaqim. As-sirat alladhina an'amta alayhim. غير مغضوب ولا ضالين. For those of you who don't know Arabic, it is a prayer that the most merciful, the most gracious, the God of the universe, the creator of the galaxies, would put us on the right way, the way of His grace. And I want to commend you, this masjid, for being on that path and allowing the Almighty God to use you in saving lives today. What an admirable record to try to save 150,000 lives through the giving of blood. May God bless us, and may God protect us, and may the God who promised to raise us continue to lead us on that path.